Hello, and welcome to the Scuttlebutt Podcast. Today, you get to hear my conversation with Chris Rawley. Chris is a 30-year captain in the Navy Reserves and the founder and CEO of Harvest Returns, an investing platform that allows individual investors to invest in farmland. This conversation is split up into two segments. In the first segment, we talk about his life as a reservist. I honestly didn't know that officers of captain and above ranks actually existed in the reserves. So we get to hear a little bit about what that role looks like. Chris talks about holding a variety of jobs throughout the years in the defense sector. And we hear how the reservist job actually set him up to acquire those positions through security clearance and direct job experience. In the second segment, we talk about his history with investing. Chris started investing in real estate early on in his career and was always attracted to the space. His knowledge of real estate and curiosity about farming during an Africa deployment helped lead him to founding his company, Harvest Returns. He gives us his thought on the agriculture landscape, the impacts of COVID and war in Ukraine on agriculture, and exciting technology in the space. Chris brings several different backgrounds into a nice cocktail of knowledge: the military, startup founder, and a wealth of knowledge on agriculture. Please enjoy this conversation with Chris Rawley. Chris, thank you so much for coming on the show today. I don't think that I can come up with a better place to start other than your rank and like the questions that it brought me to when I first found you online. You are a captain in the Navy Reserves. First off, I don't think that I knew that ranks went that high in the reserves. I'm not sure, like, the reserves is so out of place, out of mind, I guess, for the active component. And then that got me wondering, I'm like, well, is there stars in the reserves? Can you kind of like walk us through a little bit of your story and tell us about that?
Sure. I'm a Navy guy. I'm a surface warfare officer. Been in about 30 years, active in reserve. Did a ship tour on a destroyer. Then I went up to the Pentagon. Then I got off active duty, and I've, for the past 20 plus years, done all kinds of things in a reserve, been just about everywhere. But yeah, we have admirals, we have master chiefs, we have all the ranks, all the rates in the reserves, just like on active duty. It's funny because a lot of guys are just like you. When they were on active duty, they're like, I never met a reservist, on my ship or wherever I was in the squadron, wherever I was stationed. But and that's true at the kind of the most of the reservists you'll see are out there. They're on fleet staffs. They're out in CB battalions. They're out doing unique things. A lot of mobile security squadrons. They're out. Probably the guys driving around the boats protecting ships. Those are probably reservists. But there's a lot of unique places. And honestly, if you see reservists, hopefully you don't know they're reservists, because they're pretty much identical to in qualifications and skills and everything else to the active guys. So we blend in wherever we go.
Maybe a little bit of an out of regs haircut showing up for.
Yeah, you might see that every now and then. But yeah, for the most part, people are going to shave and get a haircut before they go on drill weekend or show up at their station, the duty station.
Were you an academy guy, or what? Talk about a little bit about your introduction into.
Yeah, so I did NROTC at a college here in Texas, and somewhere in high school, I knew I just had an itch to be in the military. Really liked the ocean, so I decided, I'm going to go in the Navy. I almost enlisted as a Marine. Actually, not too many people know that, but. Decided to go the ROTC route and went to A&M, and then got commissioned and went out to San Diego on a destroyer, and have been enjoying it and doing it ever since.
Good. I want to ask, it seems like, so you had 10 years on active, is that right?
7, but when you add up all my deployments and things in reserve, it's well over 10 years. Yeah.
Gotcha. I think that you might be a really good person to offer like a really good perspective about the differences between active duty and reserve. I think usually people are kind of one or the other. They're not really like, I think that that's a sufficient amount of time to be able to talk to both.
Yeah,
What's the biggest plus and maybe the biggest con
sure.
compared to?
So, we have different flavors of reserve folks. Like there are guys like me who went and, they did a single enlistment or single tour, couple tours, and then they decided they wanted to get out for various reasons, either for family reasons or they were fed up. You see a lot of that, but they still, they love the Navy, but they still want to continue to serve, but they just didn't like all the kind of the BS and, oh, the Navy was going to send me to Japan or whatever. I didn't want to go to Japan, so I got out. Those sorts of things. We also have direct entries into the reserve, both enlisted and officer. That you'll see fewer of those, but there are some where they'll go straight through a training pipeline, boot camp or OCS or whatever, and then they'll show up. Obviously the biggest difference between active and reserve is we're part-timers. Now that doesn't mean that a lot of reservists haven't, especially in the past 2 decades with the wars, mobilized and gone on active duty for 6 months or a year or whatever. But for the most time, we're that 1 week in a month, 2 weeks during the year is kind of the standard. Although a lot of reservists do a lot more than that, and there's a lot of flexibility. I'll say the pros is there's tremendous flexibility in a reserve career. We don't have kind of a normal detailing system. People apply for both officer and enlisted. They're able to sort of apply where they want to go. If you end up moving your job, your civilian job or your family for whatever reason, you can move to a new command and reserves, that's more local to you. So there's a lot of options there. Just the opportunities, you still have the same camaraderie that a lot of people I know when you transition out of the Navy, you kind of miss having that close-knit group of friends and buddies that you serve together on a ship or a squadron or base or wherever. You miss that. That doesn't really exist necessarily on the civilian side. So the reserves kind of gives you that opportunity to go and hang out and work hard and play hard and get crazy with a bunch of folks that kind of have the similar values as you do. And then, and tell the crazy sea stories and all that kind of stuff. So that's a pro for sure. You still have the opportunity to advance in rank and, get your chest candy and bonuses and things like that. And reserve retirement is nice. You don't necessarily see it till you're about 60 years old. It's not like you can retire as a 40-year-old reservist and not see a reserve payment till you're 60. But the other thing that I really enjoy, it's also a good career backstop. So you just don't have that job security in the civilian world, whether you're working for yourself or working for somebody else. It's easy to lose a job. It's easy to get laid off. I've been laid off. And fortunately, the reserve was there for me to backstop to go on orders for 5 or 6 months until I kind of found a new civilian place to be. So that's a benefit. That safety, security, the health benefits, all those sorts of things are awesome. Drawbacks, it's a balance. Although it's 1 week in a month, 2 weeks a year, that's a lot of weekends. That's at least 12 weekends a year that you're away from your family, away from football games and kids' soccer games and all that kind of thing. The 2 weeks in a year, you've got to balance that with family vacations and with being away from your civilian work. That family, civilian work, Navy balance is a hard one to do. I mean, after you've been around a while, like me, you kind of get into it and you know how to do it. But certainly for somebody transitioning, it can be tough.
That's one of the more common complaints that I hear about the reserves is it's extremely difficult to, it comes up to your 1 weekend a month and it's like you kind of are expected to like flip a switch to like go play army or not, whatever branch you're in, but go play that for the weekend. And then somehow like you kind of need to like learn to be able to shut that back off. And maybe it depends on what type of job you're in. If you maybe go back to a full-time status in the reserves, which it sounds like you may have, that may not be a problem. But did you ever experience that type of problem where you're trying to combat, I don't know, you talk differently, you walk differently? Did any of that trouble you, I guess?
No, you become pretty good at compartmentalizing your life. And honestly, a lot of it has to do with what do you do in the reserves and what do you do in your day job. If you're a corpsman in reserves and you give shots and HIV draws on drill weekends, and then you go to a clinic and you're on Monday and do the same thing, that's a pretty easy transition. But if you're like a Navy SEAL in the reserves and you go out and blow crap up and shoot things on the weekends, and then you come home on Monday and you've got you're a stockbroker or something, that's obviously a very different sort of transition. So people get good at compartmentalizing their lives, but I suppose it's probably how most people deal with it.
Would you recommend, and I want to kind of segue here into some of the jobs that you've held in the reserves, because seemingly from kind of an optical standpoint, there may be some overlap there.
Mm-hmm.
Would you recommend that people look for kind of an overlapping job comparatively to what they do in the military and what their quote unquote civilian job is?
Yeah, I wouldn't recommend it, but a lot of people do. And just my background is all over the place. But yeah, for a while I was a defense contractor, working in Special Operations Command, and I was working also within Special Operations community as a reservist. So there was some overlap there, and you've got to be, especially as you kind of get up in ranks, you got to be careful about conflicts of interest and things like that. And that's pretty manageable usually. But you also, I wouldn't say, hey, go out and actively seek a job, but when you are, actively seeking a civilian job, you should certainly think about your skill sets that the Navy or the military, taught you, and how you can apply those to that civilian job, whether it's, leadership or very specific skill sets. Like I was a truck driver in the Seabees, and now I'm a, supervisor or shipping supervisor or whatever, that sort of thing. There's certainly synergies there that you can look for when you're kind of decide what you want to do in the civilian world.
From the officer perspective, I've always been kind of curious, because that translating your military experience to like a civilian job is such a challenge. It's not just that you're managing people, you're like, the temptation is to say, oh, I was fixing this specific piece of equipment that nobody knows what that means. And kind of you need to use verbiage in ways that just normal people can understand. From the officer perspective, you have a long list of these companies, and you're welcome to talk about any of them if you'd like. Were they looking at you and saying, hey, this person has particular expertise that will help us? Or was it, this isn't to be rude, but like a title like, hey, this person is an officer in the military and that means something, so we want this person for that?
Yeah, it depends. Some people respect that. Some civilian jobs, they want that leadership experience, and they know that, if you've been an officer or a chief or whatever, you've got, some level of built-in management experience. So they're like, okay, they know. And some people, there's obviously companies that are military friendly. They want to support veterans. They specifically seek out to hire veterans. But, it can, my current job has absolutely nothing to do with anything I've done in the Navy, because there's really no parallel. It's finance and agriculture, and there's simply not a parallel there. Whereas, as I mentioned in previous jobs, there was 100% parallel to what I did. So it really depends. And again, the beauty of being a civilian is you do what you want to do. So there is a more kind of a wide open canvas landscape of what you can do. And to the extent you can apply your military experiences and qualifications and education and background to help you succeed in those roles is a good thing.
Where does a person go to start looking for jobs like that? You list positions at Electronic Data Systems, L3 Communications, this whole long list of kind of defense-oriented companies. Where do people go about like finding open positions at places like that?
Yeah, gosh, it's been a long time since I looked for a regular job, but for defense related positions, there's security clearance job boards. So, the security clearance is one thing. If you are applying for a job and you've got a security clearance that you got from the military, that makes you attractive to companies that are in that industry, because they don't have to pay for you to go out and get a security clearance. And it's I don't know how much it costs these days, but it's not a cheap thing to do all those background investigations, and they'd have to pay, a third party to do that. So if you've got a clearance, there's, clearancejobs.com, or don't quote me on that, but it's, there's things like that. You can Google security clearance jobs if you really want to do something, semi-related to what you did in the military. When you're asking about that, it just reminded me that one of the hardest parts of your transition is trying to decide what you're going to do. I think most people that get out of the military at one point or another, they might get an initial job out of the military and love it or hate it. And some people will go on to do that for the rest of their lives. And other people are like, hey, I just need a job. And, you apply for a job, you get a job, and you're like, this sucks. But it gives you time to kind of figure out what you want to do when you grow up. And I'm still trying to do that here 20 years after leaving active duty.
Still trying to figure out what you want to do when you grow up.
Right.
Well, you had mentioned before we started recording that you're a year-ish out from retiring.
Mm-hmm.
I know that like being in the reserves, it probably isn't as high a stakes of like getting out as active, but what will that change for you? And what are you thinking about that? Is that just one extra weekend that you're getting back to spend time with family, or is there any other changes that you're kind of anticipating?
Yeah, I mean, it's mostly a time thing. I'm wondering what I'm going to do with all that time. A lot of, reservists that are senior officer, senior enlisted ranks, it's, I don't know, you've probably seen the show Office Space, or the movie Office Space, where like, hey, you're only wearing 16 pieces of flare. That's the minimum requirement. Well, it's very similar to the reserve. You're only doing 1 week in a month, 2 weeks a year. Yeah, if you want to be an 06 or an E9, you're going to be doing a lot more than that, or a flag. So there is that major time constraint that you're going to be. What am I going to do with all this time? Take up hobbies, or get another job or whatever. So for me, it's just going to be mostly a time thing. And yeah, I will certainly miss it. I've worked with thousands and thousands of amazing people and gone to close to 60 countries during my, Navy career, all over the place. So I'll miss that now. I guess now I'll have time to travel on my own time and dime, which is something I like to do.
Yeah, get to travel for fun this time, Um, I hadn't put this kind of like on our agenda, but do you have any like an interesting sea story, or like maybe a funny experience, or it doesn't have to be funny, it could be serious. Anything that you got for us that might be like an entertaining story?
Yeah, I'm not much of an entertainer, but interesting stories, sure. I will say, as a reservist, you can do some much more unusual things than you might do as an active duty person, where you've got a very regimented career. I mean, I've been to Somalia. I've been to some really interesting, sketchy places in Africa that I never would have really done as an active duty guy, because it wouldn't have really fit into my career path. Jumping out of airplanes with SEALs and things like that, probably would not have done that had I stayed on active duty as a surface warfare guy. Going to Afghanistan, likely wouldn't have done that. In Iraq, serving with riverine forces, being on the rivers in southern Iraq, that sort of thing. So I will say, the Navy active reserve, whatever you're doing, or the military, it's just the amazing experiences you'll get are incomparable to anything you'll probably do in your civilian life, unless you're like some sort of, adventure racer or something like that. Because, most 9-to-5 jobs, you'll work in the civilian world, you'll work with some great people, but they just won't have the depth and breadth of experience. You won't be able to trade, oh, there's that time in Thailand where we, rolled in at 6:59, and, Liberty expired at 7 a.m. Those sorts of stories, and then we got the ship underway. How did we do that? Those sorts of stories, there's just no comparison to, your average civilian person, where they, oh, we went and played golf and then went and got drunk. Okay, cool. Yeah. That's not even a single port visit, worth of
Right.
fun.
Well, and I think that what you just said there highlights so much of happens a lot in life too, but particularly the military is you don't really realize it, I think, till much later. It's just the people. It's not necessarily some particular place that you went or whatever, but it's like, hey, that kind of shared crazy story. And I miss that element of like hearing the crazy stories. Like I didn't miss like getting in trouble for like the people that were actually doing it,
Mhm.
but like some of the stuff you just couldn't even make it up. You read the news or whatever, and like, oh, this person, everybody rags on Florida for having the craziest people. Like, that's every day on the boat. Like,
Sure.
you got a boat of 5,000 people, and that's just
Yeah.
a walk in the park. So, you hear some really, really wild stuff. I asked that question too because it seems like there's kind of a weird correlation between reservists and kind of more extra experiences, I guess. you I feel like they almost do more exciting things for some reason than the active component. I don't know why that is, but um, yeah, I'm not sure. You had kind of mentioned a few minutes ago that you're working in like the investing in the agriculture space right now, and I kind of want to get into that, but I want to start at the beginning. You have publicly stated that you worked as a portfolio manager back in like the late 90s. You want to kind of start there, how you got into the, I guess, quote unquote, investing space, and
Mhm.
kind of what your thoughts were.
Yeah. So my first job off of active duty, I worked for a big real estate company. Um, you know, one way I tell people to put it, military guys, like, what was that job? I was XO of a big office building or a portfolio of office buildings. Like anytime somebody had an issue, toilets didn't work, whatever, we had a bunch of people that worked on our team, but we were responsible for keeping those buildings running and making sure the investors were happy. And I did that for a little while. And I'm like, I don't necessarily like being an XO of the building, but I did like the investment finance side of real estate and real estate investing. So I started just like a lot of people who do real estate investing, like one house at a time, and kind of did that for a while and sort of built up my own portfolio.
Did
Really
you go
liked
to
them.
school for? Did you go to school for something in that space?
Yeah, I mean, I got my master's degree was in business. So,
Okay.
certainly learned about operating a business and all that kind of thing, which is a key part of investing in, or at least having kind of the knowledge base. So did that, but then I started investing in my own account in, houses and all that sort of thing, and bought buildings and bought land and did that sort of investing. And this is not right away. There's over a 20-year period. In hindsight, I should have gone all in. Right now, I'd be drinking Mai Tais on an island probably had I gone all in right after that. But, I did it sort of gradually because I did want to balance it against my Navy Reserve career. And, at the same time, I did get very much sucked back into the Navy post 9/11, like a lot of folks did, with some mobilizations in Iraq and Afghanistan and all that kind of thing. And that took up my time. And that was, for the most part, stuff I wanted to do. It wasn't like, oh, I got mobilized and I hated it and it sucked and they took me away from my family and my job. These are things that I volunteered to do. But then, 2014, 15, I had moved. My last deployment was out in Africa and spent a lot of time driving around to places where people just didn't have, like, super targets full of food and, restaurants in every corner and all that kind of thing, where people were, didn't take for granted the kind of food and the blessings that we have here in the US, and saw that, part of that whole dynamic was agriculture. Like people had goats in their backyard, or wandering the streets more likely in parts of Africa, and little patches of vegetables and things like that. And that's how they ate, in little markets. And it was all a different food system than I'd ever kind of realized existed. And so I thought, well, I want to try to figure out how I can invest in this and how I can kind of help agriculture and farming. And so when I got back, I thought about it, and for a couple of years trying to decide, hey, I know I want to start a company, but I don't know what it looks like. This is 2015, 2016, tried to invest in some farms, and like, man, there's not really a good way to do this. So then 2016, I kind of had this idea of like, hey, why don't I start a company that allows people to invest in farming? Because I know there's probably other people out there like me that are interested in this. And I know there's probably farmers that probably would be interested in taking investments from outside people. And so I kind of, it was sort of a long process. I brought in a business partner who's a former Army guy that I'd known for a while. And we put together this concept where we pool smaller investors and make single investments into farms and ranches. And now we do ag tech startups and agribusinesses and all kinds of things like that.
I guess, what platforms or methods were you trying to use when you were originally trying to invest, and what were the problems that you found with those? Why wasn't that viable?
Yeah. So, part of my real estate investing experience taught me that there's a steep learning curve in investing in real estate, and you can make a lot of mistakes. Once you figure it out, you can make a lot of money, and you can lose a lot of money too, but you can make a lot of money. And around 2014, 2015, due to some regulations that were passed, the Jobs Act, I guess, crowdfunding regulations essentially would enable these platforms to stand up that would allow you to invest in real estate with just a few clicks of the mouse, just like you could do to invest in stocks. And so those platforms essentially allowed the average person who may not have $1 million to go out and write a check and buy a cattle ranch to get access to, or an apartment building, let's say, to get access to those, pooling with other investors. And so that was the concept we came up with, is like, hey, these real estate platforms are doing it where people are investing in real estate and you may only have $2,000 to invest in a $2 million piece of real estate. What if we did that with agriculture and farming? And so that's the concept we built at Harvest Returns.
Very cool. Yeah, I know that there are a lot of companies that have been spawned and riding on the back of the Jobs Act. That was a very kind of key piece of legislation for opening up different venues or avenues, I guess I should say, for alternative investments and different ways that you can do that. No, a company, Angel List, is doing some really interesting things with like syndicates and like rolling funds based on the Job Act, which are really interesting. So I guess maybe kind of sum up what is like the offering that Harvest Returns do in like one or two sentences. What's the pitch?
So we offer investors a chance to diversify their portfolio in farming, ranch land, agriculture, and hopefully soon timber, that will provide non-correlated assets to the stock market. At the same time, we provide farmers with a different source of funding, and that they would get other than, say, bank loans, which is kind of the traditional ag funding.
So investors will come to you and say, hey, I want to give you X amount of dollars. You guys will then be kind of the middleman to a farmer and say, hey, we'd like to invest in your farm. And stop me if I'm wrong here.
Yeah, so it's a little bit reverse. So what happens is we've got a website, and I've got investors and I've got farmers. And so farmer comes to me and says, hey, let me give a recent example. I am starting a indoor salmon, or I have an indoor salmon aquaculture farm, and I need to expand it, and I need X million dollars of capital. And so we'll say, we'll take that and we'll come to an agreement with this farmer or agribusiness, and they will hear the terms that we're going to do the raise. Here's your minimum we're going to invest, or the maximum we're going to try to invest, and we'll go through a due diligence process where we'll review all the details of that farm, and then we'll put it up on our platform. And we have a pool of about 10,000 investors that will go on the platform, and they'll log into their account, and they'll see like, oh, there's an aquaculture deal today. I like salmon. I think I'm going to invest in this. I mean, that's simplifying the process, but they're going to go through all the documents. They're going to read. They might watch a webinar with that particular farmer and make a decision that they're going to invest. And then it literally is a few clicks of the mouse. They can invest, 10, 15, 20,000, whatever they have into this farm, and then pool those investments. Assuming we hit the minimum target, we will write a check to that farmer. And then it's an ongoing investment where we're providing tax documents, we're providing investor updates. We are, monitoring the progress of that farm or ranch or asset, and then providing distributions, whether it's kind of dividends or interest payments or an exit where, they grow the business and they sell it, and then hopefully everybody benefits.
So you guys are offering to the farmers, you can offer debt capital or equity capital. Is that right?
That's exactly right. Yep.
Okay. So like a prospective investor for to get out of the finance terms, you could be like a part owner of this, or you could just be getting interest on like loaned money, basically.
Yeah, 100% right, Brock. The main thing that differentiates our investments from, say, going out and buying, Microsoft stock or whatever is, or John Deere, if we want to talk agriculture, is that we are in private placements. So, these are smaller companies, generally startup companies, in some cases, other cases, established companies. And so there's, certain risk associated with that. But also, potential for higher returns. And there's also, something, a couple of different benefits of investing in private placements or private equity versus public stock. There's not the volatility. They're not necessarily, you look at any given stock, if you got bad news, the stock's value is going to fall, and you could, look at your 401k or whatever and say like, oh crap, I just lost $10,000 in a day. Whereas with our investments, they're private. They're not necessarily impacted by the news of the day, although they are certainly impacted by COVID and higher fuel prices and higher commodity prices, and all those sorts of positive and negative factors that impact any other business.
What's the average check size that you guys are writing?
About 600,000 or 700,000 at this point, and that's been creeping up, since we started doing these investments about 4 years ago. So we'll continue to fund larger and larger deals as we grow our base of investors. But we're also, very intent on trying to keep our investment minimums fairly low. Right now, our lowest investment, depending on, is $5,000. And, crowdfunding is a very interesting field. It sounds like you're aware that there's all different kinds of crowdfunding sites for companies that want to raise money. And, people think of like GoFundMe and Kickstarter, and that's not really crowdfunding. That's like donor sites. Even Kickstarter, that you might be pledging money to help a company. I don't know, this might get me in trouble, but Kickstarter is mostly a scam. Very few people see returns from, of their pledges or products from that. But we're equity crowdfunding. So there's other equity crowdfunding platforms out there to invest in racehorses and fine art and wine and real estate. And we just happen to be focused on the agriculture sector. And there's different regulations that allow what's called Title III reg crowdfunding, which is like kind of pure crowdfunding, where you're investing maybe $100 a pop. And so there's no requirements on, who can invest. Our investments are Regulation D. So for the most part, we're dealing with pretty high net worth people that are investing, although, there are some depending on which part of Regulation D you're talking about, there are some people that are not necessarily accredited investors. Accredited is a measure of person's income and net worth. So there are, we have to work within a regulatory framework that the SEC provides us, and it's not always great for investors or for companies like ours. But those are the rules that we're living within.
How are you guys sourcing deals, or I guess determining like the hurdles? So let's say that I'm a farmer and I come to you and say, hey, I've got this great business plan, and we want all this money, and you look at them and say, this is the dumbest idea that I've ever heard. Like, what's your guys' diligence process on like, hey, do we want to bring this to the investors? I'm assuming that the variety of deals that you guys are bringing come with different yields on all of them and kind of varying degrees of return. What is that kind of diligence process? Because things like this, in my view, are coming down to like what deals are being brought to the table. And that's kind of where you guys come in. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. It's only about, I don't know, 3 or 4% of the deals that cross our desks that come in, via our website for the most part, but we get a lot of referrals, and they find me on LinkedIn. They find us on social media. These farmers find us everywhere. Only about 3 or 4% actually make it onto the platform. Of those that make it on the platform, roughly 85% get funded. And, that's one of the things as an investor in crowdfunding is, we have our due diligence process, but investors have their own due diligence process, right? And we encourage that. They ask questions and they ask for documentation and all those sorts of things. They make a decision. If they decide not to invest, then it's probably not a good investment. If a pool of investors gets together and looks at an investment and says, yeah, we think we're going to fund this, there's probably good reasons. But, primary things we look at a business plan, it's nice to have a good, a pretty business plan or pitch deck or whatever. So, and this goes for not just the deals we do, but if you're an entrepreneur and you want to raise capital from outside investors, it's common, no matter what you're doing, what kind of company you want to start, but like, what is the idea sound? So a lot of people have great ideas, but um, they don't have the team to back it. So we look for a combination of, is the business sound, but is the team behind it, or the people behind it, can they execute? So, we have a lot of, in our space, we have a lot of people that are like, hey, I'm a 4th generation farmer and I can grow a tomato out of concrete. Cool. Show me how you're going to make money for my investors doing that. And then, show me your financial projections, and we lose them, so that's an automatic buy. You're sorry, you're going to have to go somewhere else for your capital, because if you can't show me that you know how to put together, financial plan. So, and this doesn't have to be a single person. That same farmer came to me and said, hey, I've been growing tomatoes for 4 generations. And oh, by the way, my partner is an accountant and has run successful businesses, and here's our business plan. And I have another partner who is a salesperson, and they are, have a deep Rolodex of grocery contacts or restaurant contact. Okay, that's somebody I want to talk to, and I'm specifically thinking, a lot of indoor farmers. We're starting to see more and more indoor agriculture, which is a really hot sector that we like. And we're one of the few places that you can actually invest in it, that an individual investor can invest in indoor ag projects. But we want a team, we want a business plan, we want a product. We're not so much looking at, this, you're putting your land. There are some, farm investments where you want to make sure that, hey, the land is fertile and all those sorts of things, but we're investing in a team, not necessarily the land. So, or the company. So you want to have a company that can actually, put together a plan and execute it.
That's generally a good place to start. You don't want them burning up your money. I do want to talk about kind of the agriculture space generally. I had one other question about like the platform, I guess, in general. How do you have a sense for, or can you give us a sense for how many investors? You said you about 10,000 or so. Do you have a ballpark figure for how much capital you've deployed on the platform, or some kind of figure to give us a sense of scale?
Yeah, I mean, we've deployed more than $20 million. So, if you look at like VC funds, kind of a small VC fund, we're sort of in that ballpark, or a small private equity firm. We're growing. We just did our own seed round, so we raised a couple $1 million, and now we're starting to deploy that to scale. Up until now, we've sort of not really taken any outside investments into our own company, but we're sort of shifting that, and expect to get in some new things this year based on having that capital to apply.
Want to hear a little bit about the agriculture space. Like I said, generally, it sounds like your interest in the space was derived on your own observations prior to kind of you're looking for maybe a problem to solve. There's a constant article that rolls around that talks about how Bill Gates is one of the largest owners of farmland in the country. That's always a really interesting statistic. And several very wealthy people in the country have exorbitant amounts of farmland. Why is farmland important? What have you learned about the space since doing this? Where is like our country's opportunity to improve? Kind of just any thoughts that you have about that.
Yeah, great questions, Brock. So as an asset class, agriculture is kind of underinvested. It's really not something people come to mind like, hey, I'm going to go out and buy a stock or whatever. They don't think of farming. They think of technology, and that's, it's just not a sexy asset class, although that's sort of changing with agriculture technology. And that's one of the sort of verticals that we focus on. But from an investor perspective, to me, it's very compelling for several reasons. One is just demographics. We have a little thing on our website. I think if you go to the front of the website, talks about a quote from somebody that says, in the next 30 to 40 years, we're going to need to produce as much food as has been produced in the last 10,000 years of human history. And that's just because, we've got 7+ billion people on the planet right now. We're going to be shifting towards 10 billion, circa 2050. So, on top of that, as societies get more wealthy, and most countries are, one way or the other, getting more wealthy, they tend to consume more food, more calories. So the need for food production is going to have to go up. At the same time, you've got to do that in a resource constrained environment. So land is a constrained resource. Arable land is constrained resource. Water is hugely constrained. We're seeing that right now. And you've got to be able to grow food sustainably. So less fertilizer runoff, carbon emissions, something a lot of people think about, all those sorts of things. So how is that transforming, and what's the harvest returns piece of that is where, like I said, we're very bullish on indoor agriculture. If you go to a grocery store and buy a head of lettuce, wherever you live in the United States, it's a very high probability that lettuce was grown in Salinas Valley, California, or piece of whatever kind of leafy greens, just because that's where the fertile soil is, that's where the perfect climate is, and that's where, sort of in the 1940s and 50s, that whole industry moved to grow leafy greens. Well, that's good until you have supply chain disruptions, until the price of fuel skyrockets. So it costs a lot more to ship that head of lettuce from Northern California to New York or whatever. So one of the things that we like is indoor agriculture, the decentralization, distribution, what I call the decentralization of agriculture, where why should I ship a head of lettuce from Salinas Valley, California, when I can grow it in New Hampshire or Texas or wherever? The soil may not be right in New Hampshire to grow a head of lettuce. The temperature is certainly not right. You've got winters, but now you have greenhouses and vertical farms where you can grow 24/7, and you grow on a smaller footprint and create a yield of crop that is significantly more than you could get on the same acreage of field grown produce. You're not producing the same amount of, you're not producing any fertilizer runoff. You're using less fertilizer, you're using maybe zero to little pesticides. So there's all kinds of environmental benefits. And more importantly, you're producing food where it can be harvested one day and on your table the next. So it's that whole farm to table movement. And there's a lot of benefits for that besides just the environmental benefits. There's you're seeing fresher produce, and there's indications that the fresher the produce is, the more nutrients it has, and all that sort of thing. So indoor ag and all the technologies behind that, we think, is a big sector and growing sector.
It sounds like that is, at least from your perspective, the direction that this space is going. I'm imagining there's some larger complexities that keep it from moving much faster, because all of that sounds, really great. If we can have a higher yield with less greenhouse gas emissions and all of these things, like, that's awesome. What's the holdup? I'm guessing it's got to be a money thing. It's probably ultra expensive to get these things done versus just planting it outside in California when you can grow 9 months out of the year.
Yeah, I mean, you're 100% right. It's a capital thing. These are capital intensive technologies, and so that's one hand. On the other hand, it's a very fragmented space. There's been a couple of IPOs and unicorns for companies that are trying to do this on a large scale, but at the same time, it's very new. So we're working through profitable business models. You have, even though you're growing food indoors, you still got labor issues. You may not have as many laborers to pick on an indoor farm, and they're working on all sorts of, as you might on a field grown farm of, hundreds and hundreds of acres, but you still got to have labor, both skilled and unskilled. You still have water issues. If you're growing like vertical farms, you got electricity consumption. You got to maintain the right environment to grow food indoors, both from, power all those LED lights, and then maintain proper temperature and humidity if you're in an environment where it's closed. And then it's so new that people don't really know. We started seeing some of the risk and some of the benefits, but that we haven't gotten to an equilibrium there where people are like, this is definitely going to work. I have a gut feeling it's going to work, but we're going to have to do a lot of iterations and kind of settle on the right models and the right companies in the space. And, I'm trying to find the next sort of McDonald's of indoor farms, where we've invested in some of these small scale urban vertical farms, where if I can find that person or that team that can do this successfully and make a lot of money and then replicate it, and then have one of these all over be the McDonald's where they franchise the concept or whatever. And we really haven't seen that yet, but I think it's coming at some point, and hopefully we're going to be a part of it.
I'm sure that you're probably investing in maybe some like very early stage companies like in ag tech. One of the companies that came to mind when you mentioned IPOs, I immediately thought of App Harvest. I'm sure that you're familiar with them. I also have, I forget what the company's name is, but they're like talking about like watering and growing crops from like drones and like there's just like so the sky's the limit in terms of like opportunities there
Yeah.
In terms of like applying technology to the agriculture space. What is the thing that you have seen that you're the most excited about?
So yeah, ag tech is huge and growing. I think last year there was record investment into agriculture technology and that sort of thing. And we have done, besides indoor ag, we've done several investments in precision, what's called precision agriculture. And that's the use of, it kind of varies all over the board, but like you said, drones and satellites for surveillance. So, whereas in the old days, if you want to know what was going on in a farmer's field, you'd have to walk kind of row by row and see like, oh, those plants are dying, or these plants aren't getting enough water, or these plants are diseased. And, I've got to, apply fertilizer, apply pesticide or whatever. Now you can fly a drone over and they use multispectral imaging, or you can do a satellite and you can see like, oh crap, this quarter my farm is not done. So that imaging is one piece. Sensor technology is big. And, I guess part of my Navy experience is I understand a lot of this technology inherently. It's almost like surveillance or whatever, where you've got radars and you know what's going on in your environment. Same thing, we're putting sensors in soil, moisture sensors. We help fund a company that has like smoke sensors. So up in there's been a lot of fires in Northern California. So that smoke comes and goes over a vineyard and taints some of the grapes. And the farmer produces all those grapes and then they put out the wine and it tastes like crap because it's smoke tainted. And they basically ruin that batch. Whereas some of these sensors that this company does will allow you to see like, oh, this don't harvest this half acre of my vineyard because it's the wildfire smoke, tainted it. So we're not going to bother putting that into wine production. So those sorts of things. And it's going out and using big data and analysis to modernize agriculture. And it saves water, saves fertilizer applications, saves labor, all those sorts of benefits, both from an environmental standpoint and a cost standpoint. Agriculture technology is making a big difference out there. And that's not, I don't really understand biotechnology, but that's a whole other aspect of agriculture tech that is changing the industry.
Funny, I don't know if you're a whiskey guy at all, but you pay for a real expensive smoky taste in whiskey, but apparently with wine that doesn't go over so well.
Yeah, exactly right. There's probably some vintages or some flavors. I like wine, but I'm not by no means smart on it, where maybe a little bit of oakiness, smokiness is a good thing, but I think for the most part, not so much.
Not so much on the wildfire side.
Yeah.
I'm not sure where we'll go with this, but what are you seeing, or are you exposed to the cannabis industry at all? Anybody that's kind of remotely related, I'd love to hear if you're seeing trends there, or what you think about it from your perspective.
Yeah, so we haven't done any cannabis investments, and there's a couple of reasons. There's a lot of reasons we haven't done cannabis investments. One is because I still have a security clearance and I don't want to lose it. The regulatory environment is still sketchy. I mean, state by state, kind of the dominoes are falling. The state goes from marijuana, THC totally outlawed to, okay, we'll do medicinal marijuana, to anything goes, but we're going to put regulations on it. California being the perfect example. And so that leads into the next part of the equation is like, is this a good investable asset? Well, if you look at California specifically, they made the marijuana industry legal, but they heavily regulated it, like overly regulated it. And that was because the California regulators, like they see a lot of things, see it as a tax potential in the crop. And so they took these guys that were growing illegal pot for, decades and said, okay, you need to apply for $100,000 growing permit. And, a lot of these smaller scale, mom and pop pot farmers, especially in places like Humboldt County, California, said, no effing way, we're not gonna pay $100,000. I'm just gonna keep doing it illegally, like I have for the past 30 years. And meanwhile, is how do you invest in that? Because if you're trying to invest in a legal, legit operation, that guy is having to pay all kinds of high taxes and fees and permitting fees and things. And how is he competing with the illegal crop? So have been, a lot of people made a lot of money, especially in Canadian companies, sort of during that initial cannabis gold rush. And the other analogy related to that is the people that made the real money are the pick and shovel guys. Just like when there was the gold rush, like who's selling the picks? The guys mining for gold are losing their ass, but the people selling the picks and the shovels are making a lot of money. So the guys that are selling the fertilizer and the LED lights and the growing mediums and all those sorts of things were making a lot of money, whereas the actual producers themselves were not. Now, all that said, the related crop is hemp, and there is still a lot of, inconsistent regulation around hemp. We have done a couple of hemp CBD related investments, which I don't know if I would have done if given a choice again, but we have done those with various levels of success or unsuccess. And so we need to, it's just not, if you're an investor or you're an entrepreneur, you're like, hey, I want to start a pot farm. It's like, hey, make sure you figure out what that looks like before you dive into it, just because either you enjoy the product or think you're going to make a lot of money. That's neither one of the, that's not necessarily true.
Yeah. It's crazy to me, some of these cannabis farmers and producers or whatever, like the regulatory hurdles, like you're mentioning, that they have to go through. It's not only are you having to deal with the conventional problems of farming, but you're also dealing with like, oh, I can only work in cash, and like, it's illegal in this state, and the environment just incredibly challenging. And from a public perspective, maybe that's an opportunity. Fairly plugged in with the financial industry, I guess, and it's so interesting to me to see fund managers not allowed to invest in the cannabis space like legally, and so it kind of opens up some opportunities. But a very interesting space indeed. I was just kind of curious your take on it. Want to hear a little bit about what you've seen through COVID and the recent news and attacks on Ukraine. There's a lot of talks about the large amount of corn and like different crops that are coming from Ukraine and Russia, like very, very large percentages. What do you think that means for the US? Does that really just come back to what you were saying? Like we really need to be self-sufficient and kind of decentralize away from California and grow our own stuff? There are farmers in our country that are paid not to produce some year to maintain a certain level of output and hold price stability. A lot of interesting economics there that go into that. But yeah, I would love to hear what you think about that.
Yeah, well, that's a lot of aspects to that question. So, based on my Navy Reserve stuff, I'm pretty well familiar and pretty intimately involved, at least I have been, with what was going on with Russia and Ukraine. I was in Ukraine last summer for a couple of weeks as a senior mentor to the Ukrainian Navy. And then earlier this year, I was participating out in Europe, kind of as that Russia thing ramped up for a while. So yeah, very interesting what's going on there. Unfortunate, especially for the Ukrainian people. But it's referred to as often as the breadbasket of Europe. They produce a lot of wheat, a lot of corn, a lot of sunflowers and canolas. That's kind of the primary crops in Ukraine. And some of those crops are getting planted this spring. Hopefully, all those will get to maturity, but who knows with what's going on with the war. So a lot of dynamics there on top of sort of the global inflation that we see happening in the fuel prices rising. Agriculture is like any other industry. There's a lot of inputs that go into it. So primary being fertilizer, and fertilizer prices have shot through the roof. Russia happens to be one of the highest single producers of potash. Same thing with Ukraine is a significant fertilizer producer. So those supply chains are being disrupted. That's impacting farmers in the U.S., causing higher prices, although they were already seeing those higher prices. just due to some inflationary factors last year. USDA, I'm generally an anti-government, anti-regulation kind of guy, and USDA, they're on the good side, they're giving these grants of $250 million to fertilizer producers in the U.S. to try to become more self-sufficient. On the bad side, farmers are asking to take those crops that you referred to, conservation program, CRP, where the farmers are paid not to grow them because commodity prices are going up, and because we know that there's this need for production. Farmers are asking, hey, USDA, can I take this land out of CRP this year and actually grow crops instead of being paid not to, because I know I can make money and I know that the industry needs it. And USDA so far is saying no, which is idiotic, but that's what they're doing. It'll probably get me in trouble with somebody, but that's so it's definitely a big deal. What's going on in Ukraine? The other part of that is probably not going to, we're all going to see rising food prices as we already have here in the U.S. But in some parts of the world, this Ukraine-Russia thing might cause food security problems and starving. We might be watching the news in the fall and seeing starving kids in North Africa, because that's, even though Ukraine produces, like as a whole, produces like say less wheat than the significantly less wheat than the United States. They export 73% of their wheat. Same thing with corn. They export most of it. And most of that wheat goes to North Africa. A lot of it, a lot of their corn goes to China. So there's going to be some second and third order effects that I think are hard to predict if those crops aren't produced, and more importantly, can't be shipped. Right now you don't want to be a ship in the Black Sea, in the northern Black Sea, due to all the things that are going on there.
It's interesting to see how the last couple of years, just with COVID and particularly this Ukraine-Russia problem, hitting so many aspects of the things that we believed in so strongly, like in terms of globalization. Like, we're so adamant about like everybody playing nice and just getting along, and if we all just make what we can and export and import, then we'll all get along. And this is like, and not even to mention like just-in-time inventory management, and how like that just completely went out the window and probably will never maybe happen again in our lifetime, just because of the supply chain crisis that this has caused. But there's going to be some really interesting history books written about this time, and how policies changed as a result of just kind of a couple black swan events almost back to back on top of each other here. Did you have any other thoughts on your company, your thoughts on building a company? That might be an interesting topic to hear from, using and leveraging Navy experience to kind of start and build a company. I think that military members make great operators of businesses generally. Would you recommend that path to people?
Yeah, they make great operators. The question is, do they make great entrepreneurs? I guess, had I tried to start a company straight out of the Navy, one thing the Navy teaches you is how to execute things, right? The military is like, you got a checklist for everything. You got a checklist no matter what it is. So Navy guys are very good at, here's a plan, go execute. And so the execution piece, I think most military folks as a, rising up in business and working for somebody else and working with other things, they're really good at. Entrepreneurial piece, I wouldn't say so. I mean, it took me this long to kind of free myself from boundaries, and I'm kind of I'm not a very conventionally thinking guy. And I started a company that nobody else had started before. It wasn't like, hey, I'm going to go start a popsicle stand, and there's 400 other popsicle stands just like mine. We started an equity crowdfunding company for agriculture. We were the first guys to do it. And now there's a handful of other ones, doing ag investments online. And so we were, as they say, pioneers tend to get a lot of arrows in their back. So that was us. I mean, we learned a lot. We made a lot of mistakes, and we're still making them. And, to the extent my military career has taught me to adapt and overcome and execute and not quit. That's probably the biggest benefit of it. As far as like negotiation and free thinking, most military guys suck at those two things, especially the negotiation piece. And it's taken me a lot of time to unwind some of those bad habits. And they're not necessarily bad habits. If you're working in the military and somebody tells you to do something, you do it. Where if you're working in a civilian world and a supplier or contractor or whatever comes from, or even an employee comes to me and says, this is what this is what I want, or this is what I wanted you to do, you can say no. You say, no, how about this? It's a different, it's a different sort of mindset. And, that's probably not been great for my senior military career, getting into that mindset, but it has been good for my business career.
Let's fast forward 5 years, maybe, or maybe 10 years. If Harvest Returns is maybe going public at that time and it is like the next big thing and you achieve like a massive valuation, what will have gone right for you guys
Wow,
to get
probably
to that point?
what will have gone right is they would have replaced me as CEO, because that's probably the way we're going to get to that point is find somebody either better than me or that has the aptitude to grow the company to that scale. But I certainly, we want to grow, but we want to continue to do our mission of helping farmers and providing good investments to the investor side. It's hard for me to look 10 years out in anything. I can look, near term, we're going to continue to do what we want to do and build a profitable company. And that's, to me, that's important. There's, as you well know, there's companies that grow out there, and especially kind of the West Coast Silicon Valley mindset, where like, hey, all I got to do is keep getting my next funding round. It doesn't matter if I make a dime. And, quite honestly, App Harvest might be one of those companies. I don't know, I haven't looked at their financials lately, but, let's just get to the next, let's get to the next funding round, which is great if you're a founder and you make a lot of money. It's not necessarily great if you're a shareholder, or, it depends on when you came into the company, but also, if you're an employee or, somebody that relies on that company, it's not necessarily a viable model over the long term. That's certainly not the way companies like IBM or Johnson & Johnson or General Motors or any of those kind of companies were built. They were built based on being a profitable company. So it remains to be seen, how that sort of aggressive Silicon Valley model works for the world over the long term. There are obviously exceptions. You've got companies like Google and Apple that are, printing cash, just drowning in cash, but they created very, very successful products that, eventually became profitable. But there's so many other companies that are just based on an idea and more funding.
I think that hits the nail on the head. We have been in a very aggressive market for a large amount of years. And I think that the growing looseness in terms of like what is considered a business idea it's getting less and less. The requirement and hurdle there is less. So it's a breath of fresh air to hear like somebody that's like focused on profitability, and you may get some heat from it now, but if we, 6 months from now are in a recession, everybody will probably wish that they would have been doing that as well. You're kind of, I would say, unconventional in that way, and I'm going to use a really bad segue here. You're, if I have my notes here correctly, the author of a book, Unconventional Warfare, if you see what I did there, 2.0. Let's, I want to hear about that. What was the goal of the book? What led you to write it?
Yeah, I guess that was a bucket list thing, like starting a company. I also had a bucket list to write a book. So, unconventional warfare by definition is supporting insurgencies. So, what we tried to do unsuccessfully really for 20 years in Afghanistan and Iraq, it's the other side of that. It's the other side of the coin, pun intended, counterinsurgency, where an outside entity is coming in and supporting rebels, insurgents, to overthrow a government or overthrow a government in place. So the most classic textbook case, probably most successful unconventional warfare campaign in the past 50 years, as far as I'm concerned, was what our Green Berets and CIA to a certain extent did in the very first month or so of Afghanistan, where we came in. These guys landed, they jumped on horses. I've got friends that were involved in this that I worked with at SOCOM. Pretty amazing. There's movies, movies and books written about it. And they basically gathered all these loose alliance, Northern Alliance guys that had been fighting jihadis and fighting the Russians before that. And they went and they overthrew the Taliban in like 3 or 4 days with minimal casualties on our side, minimal expenditures, completely 100% the opposite of what we did, the next 20 years unsuccessfully in Afghanistan. And it's basically taking small forces and leveraging them to create outsized effects. So when I worked at SOCOM and in some of my Navy, in joint jobs, I worked with a lot of Green Berets, and it really, changed the way I thought, because these guys are definitely unconventional thinkers, not just unconventional warfare. So, as I watched some of these events unfold and talked to a lot of people, I actually ended up writing a paper for one of my Navy, joint professional military education classes. And the professor said it was awesome. It won some kind of like best paper of the class or whatever. I'm like, at the same time, I saw a lot of people that were putting their thesis from their master's degree at Naval Postgraduate School online, or they weren't putting it, they put it in the big public DoD inventory, and then somebody would come in and steal it and put it on Kindle and take their name off of it, and they would make money with it. And I'm like, well, I don't want anybody to take my paper, so I'm going to put it on Kindle myself and make a little money off of it, and at least copyright and take credit for it. So I expanded on what I'd done, and I turned it into a little small book. It's by no means, a large definitive tome, but some of the rewarding things about that was, after I did that, a couple of years after that, I was approached by people in special forces, that the schoolhouse that trained special forces guy, like, hey, we want to buy a whole bunch of your books. The Canadian Special Forces Regiment came and said, hey, can we buy your books? We don't really have a budget, but we want to put these and give these to all our trainees. And I'm like, here, just take it, man. I'm not in this to necessarily make money. So I've seen, people like the concepts in there, I think, are still sound for the most part. We're seeing a lot of that in Ukraine now, with, where essentially the parts of Ukraine that are occupied, or hopefully not much more becomes occupied, basically send in materials and training, and you enable these underdogs to defeat a much larger opponent. And the book gets into kind of all that stuff. There's also some incredible stories I know, personally, about like the Free Burma Rangers, really crazy dynamic guy named Dave Eubanks, who I've got some personal family connections to that whole story, but really amazing people these Green Berets are, and what they do and are able to achieve. So I have I have a lot of respect for everybody in the military, but especially some of the Green Berets I've worked with.
Like a fantastic experience, and I think that it's notable when you like feel passionate enough about something to like try and turn it into a book. Do you see yourself writing another one, or was that a one and done type of deal?
Yeah, maybe that's what I'll do when I get out of the Navy. When I retire from the Navy Reserve, I'll have so much more time on my hand, that, concentrated time to think. Because to be a good writer, it takes practice, right? I think you could probably look at, very few people have that innate writing ability. Most people get really good at writing because they read a lot. So if your writing skills suck, start reading, and not just, whatever's going down your social media feeds. Like, go and pick up an actual paper book off the bookshelf and sit down and read it constantly, and find your favorite authors and absorb your writing style, and then start writing. I don't know. We'll see.
If you had to kind of collectively sum up your 30 years in the Navy into a sentence or two in terms of the things that have been the most impactful or the biggest takeaway, what would you say? And what would you maybe have done differently?
I don't know if I'd done anything differently. I'm very happy. I got to be very selective with what I did in the Navy, and until I got very, very senior. Well, even when I got very, very senior, I had a lot of choice in what I did, and got to do, I got to choose my own career. And that's kind of one of our little Navy Reserve catchphrases: be your own kind of Navy reservist, or be your own kind of SWO. But most of the experiences and the people I did them with, whether it was on Liberty, whether it was in combat zone, whether it was sitting around the office smoking and joking, it's hard to beat that. As you said, that the people you encounter, such a wide variety of backgrounds. The military is the great equalizer, where you may have grown up in a little town and gone to a little high school or gone to college, whatever, and everybody thinks the same. You get in the Navy, and like, bam, your life is your experiences are broadened overnight, just because of the people you're dealing with, good, bad, and great.
Really put a plug in there for reading some good books. I'm assuming, and I will take that to mean that you read probably pretty heavily. What are you reading right now, and any recommendations you might have?
What am I reading right now? That's probably not enough. I picked up a book on 16th century Mediterranean warfare. Basically the post-Crusades conflicts. And I'm sorry, I can't remember what, because I picked it up in the airport and I've just started reading it, what the title is. But I read another book. Paul Theroux is one of my favorite authors. He's a travel author. He travels all over the world and makes interesting observations. So I'm reading a book about his travels over the southern United States, which I didn't like because I thought he would maybe stereotype Southern people, and being from Texas, I kind of identify with that, but he didn't. He's done a very fair treatment of it. So, I like travel books. I like history books. I like some fiction, but a lot of nonfiction as well.
I can hang with that. Where can people go to find out more about you if they want to? Where can they learn about harvest returns if they want to invest with you? Where would you want to send people?
Yeah, I'm open to contacts. I'm on LinkedIn. Just hit me up. Tell me you saw me on a podcast, and tell me what you want to talk about, and we'll set up a call or a Zoom or whatever. Harvestreturns.com, or of course we're in all the social media. I've got a great marketing social media team: Twitter, Instagram, LinkedIn, Facebook. I think YouTube. We're all over the place. So just Google us and you can find us. And if you're interested in agriculture, give me a call. We'll talk.
Fantastic. Chris, thank you so much for your time. This has been great.
Yeah, you too, Brock. Thanks.
Thanks so much for tuning in today. Your listenership helps me better educate people like you and the rest of our nation's military, both past and present, on building a successful life outside of military service. If you're looking for more ways the top vets are leading more effective lifestyles, building businesses, and using the resources designed specifically for you, press here for a selection of some of the best clips. Be sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel to stay up to date, and I will be talking with you soon.